Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight, we're tracing the story of the one object every civilization has used, ignored, and reinvented: the bed. It's where people have slept, fallen ill, been born, died, and occasionally managed a few hours of actual rest. Before we start, do me one small favour. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. If you'd prefer these stories without ads, you can join the Patreon. It's linked in the description. And if you want the ultimate immersive experience, consider using a pair of wireless earbuds. They're comfortable, discreet, and designed so you can wear them even while sleeping. I've linked my favourite pair plus other sleep tools in the description. Now, lie back, get comfortable. Let's begin. The story of the bed does not begin in palaces or temples, but in caves, dark hollows that promised shelter from wind and predators, and perhaps the illusion of peace. Archaeologists have found that even in these earliest refuges, people did not sleep directly on the ground. They prepared their resting places carefully, not for comfort, but for survival. In South Africa's Border Cave, researchers uncovered what may be the world's first known bedding layers, traces of plant mats that date back roughly 200,000 years. These ancient sleepers gathered leaves and grasses, such as panicoidea and phragmites, flattening them into mats that softened the rock beneath them. The layers were sprinkled with ash, not by accident, but by design. Ash repelled crawling insects, including the ancestors of bedbugs and fleas. It was the prehistoric version of pest control, and perhaps the first time anyone attempted to improve their sleep environment. The discovery implies not idleness, but intelligence. These early people understood that the ground was alive, and that to rest upon it safely, one must first quiet it. Elsewhere across Africa, similar evidence emerges: flattened vegetation, charred patches, and the faint outlines of sleeping hollows shaped by repeated human use. Some researchers believe these bedding areas were slightly raised or bordered by stones, suggesting that even before architecture, there was furniture of a kind. Low, temporary, and made entirely from the landscape itself, sleep was not private, it was communal. A small group, perhaps a family or a hunting band, would huddle together for warmth and vigilance. Fire provided both, but it also demanded care. If the flames died, so might those who slept too deeply. The night was not for rest as we understand it, but for cautious stillness between dangers. The earliest beds were therefore not expressions of luxury, but of strategy. To sleep safely, one had to balance exposure and concealment, close enough to the fire to stay warm, far enough to avoid smoke and sparks, high enough to escape dampness, but low enough not to be seen from outside the cave. The bedroom, if the term even applies, was a negotiation between comfort and risk. A modern mattress isolates its owner from the world. A prehistoric one was made of the world, stitched from soil, ash, and plant fibres. Animal behaviour gives us further clues. Many primates build sleeping nests in trees, weaving branches and leaves into shallow cradles. Fossil evidence suggests early humans may have done something similar before mastering the use of fire. To sleep above the ground was to gain safety from snakes and hyenas, but as control over fire grew, humans gradually descended to the earth again. With warmth and protection secured, the ground became viable once more. The bed in its most primitive sense was an early triumph over fear, a declaration that, for a few hours at least, the world could be trusted. Archaeologists can read these intentions in microscopic detail. Under magnification, the border cave layers reveal compressed plant tissues arranged deliberately, not randomly. Successive layers show renewal, old bedding burned or buried, new mats laid over the top. This cycle of cleaning, replacing, and organising hints at something striking: maintenance. These people were not merely existing from one night to the next. They were managing a space. The routine of shaking out grass, scattering ash, and smoothing surfaces each evening might seem trivial, but it marks a step toward domesticity. The impulse to improve one's sleeping surface is the quiet beginning of civilization. What these ancient beds lacked in softness, they made up for in adaptation. Plant mats breathed, releasing moisture, ash dried the air and deterred rot. Insects avoided alkaline surfaces. Over time, these combinations of vegetation and ash formed natural insulation against the chill of the earth. Some sites show mixtures of aromatic plants like wild basil, whose oils repel mosquitoes. Whether chosen intentionally for their scent or simply for availability, their presence makes it tempting to imagine that the earliest beds may have even smelled faintly clean. The first hint of comfort, perhaps, arrived by accident. Yet to call it comfort would be generous. Sleep in the Pleistocene was brief and broken. The human body evolved under open skies, guided by darkness and dawn rather than clocks. People likely slept in multiple short bouts, waking to feed the fire, check for predators, or tend to infants. The absence of artificial light kept circadian rhythms tied strictly to nature. Dreams were not the refuge they would later become. They were interruptions, strange and possibly unwelcome. Rest was a resource to be rationed, not pursued. In this world, the difference between life and death could depend on where you chose to lie down. Sleeping too near the cave entrance meant exposure. Too far inside meant suffocation from smoke or lack of ventilation. The physical arrangement of bedding within a cave reveals an early sense of spatial planning. Elders and infants likely slept toward the center, protected by others. Firelight flickered across their faces, illuminating the shared fragility of the group. The ashes of one night became the foundation of the next. From these layers, archaeologists can count the passing of generations. The bed, even then, was a record. If the idea of a good night's sleep existed at all, it was measured by survival until morning. In that sense, prehistoric beds did their job well. They insulated against cold, discouraged pests and gave weary hunters and gatherers a few hours of safety in a world that offered little. The materials were local, renewable, and disposable, a perfect expression of early human pragmatism. Each morning the sleepers rose, stretched and walked away, leaving behind a faint impression in the dirt that would outlast them by millennia. Modern comfort began here, though no one then could have named it. The very act of improving the place where one sleeps, of separating rest from raw ground, set humanity on a path that would eventually lead to carved wood, gilded canopies and mattresses that hum with electronics. But for tens of thousands of years, the nightly ritual remained humble. Gather grass, scatter ash, and lie down beside the fire. The day's end required nothing more complicated than that. When people began to build settlements rather than wander through landscapes, sleep itself changed. The cave and the temporary camp gave way to the house, a boundary between human order and the untidy world outside. Within that boundary, the ground could finally be reconsidered. The floor was no longer the only option for rest. The first true beds appear not as inventions of comfort, but as extensions of architecture. Small platforms lifted from the earth to protect against moisture, insects, and whatever might crawl or slither in the dark. To sleep above the ground was to assert that one had tamed a small portion of it. The earliest known bed frames, found in Egypt and Mesopotamia, were built from what the surrounding environment offered: wood, reeds, and woven rope. These raised structures solved a practical problem first. Heat and humidity invited pests, and sleeping close to the soil meant sharing space with them. A few inches of elevation allowed air to circulate and kept the sleeper drier. The earliest examples were simple rectangles of timber lashed together, their surfaces made of interwoven cord or flexible reeds that could be tightened or replaced as they sagged. In archaeological terms, they were basic. In cultural terms, they were transformative. For the first time, people could separate their bodies from the ground that had sustained and buried their ancestors. Nowhere did this new idea of sleep take on more meaning than in ancient Egypt. By around 3000 BCE, Egyptian artisans were producing beds that were not merely functional, but symbolic. Excavated examples from tombs at Tarkhan and Thebes reveal carved wooden frames with legs shaped like animal limbs, lions for strength, bulls for fertility, sometimes the hooves of gazelles for grace. These were not decorative whims. They suggested that even in rest, the sleeper drew upon the power of the natural world. Some beds curved gently upward at the head, anticipating the pillow, but stopping short of inventing one. Instead, a separate wooden headrest supported the neck, keeping the head elevated and the elaborate hairstyles of the elite intact. To modern sensibilities, it seems uncomfortable, but to an Egyptian noble it signified refinement, to hold one's head high even in sleep. Archaeologists have found traces of linen sheets and woven mats on these frames, hinting at layered bedding. Linen spun from flax was a hallmark of Egyptian sophistication. It cooled the skin, absorbed sweat, and displayed wealth through thread count long before that phrase existed. Linen required irrigation, harvest, and laborious spinning, luxuries only possible in a stable agricultural society. To sleep on it was to participate in a social hierarchy that extended from the pharaoh's palace down through scribes, artisans, and servants. Even the simplest woven mat carried the scent of domestication, the triumph of agriculture over wilderness. Mosquitoes, always a problem along the Nile, shaped bed design as much as aesthetics did. Some high-status households hung fine netting or draped gauze from wooden frames to keep insects away. Others relied on smoke from oil lamps or incense. Servants, by contrast, slept on the floor or on rolled mats of papyrus and palm fibre, close enough to the ground that heat and humidity were unavoidable. The difference between a sleeping mat and a carved bed was the difference between anonymity and identity. The bed had become a social declaration, a quiet but unmistakable way of saying who mattered. If Egypt gave the bed its elegance, Mesopotamia gave it its permanence. Between the Tigris and Euphrates, the cradle of civilization produced the first written inventories of domestic life. Clay tablets from Sumerian and later Babylonian periods mention reed mats, divans, and couches used for both sitting and sleeping. These were usually constructed from bundles of reeds coated in bitumen or woven into mats and stretched over wooden frames. As in Egypt, height conferred status. The higher the platform, the greater the rank of its owner. Beds could be dismantled and moved, yet they were heavy enough to require servants, another mark of wealth. Household accounts from Mesopotamian palaces describe beds of ivory and wood, alongside plainer versions for attendants. The royal divan might be draped with textiles dyed in indigo or madder red, stuffed with wool, and perfumed with cedar oil. Beneath it, the floor was covered in reed matting to catch dust and insects. Mesopotamian artisans even developed low tables or footstools to accompany the bed, beginning the long association between sleeping and furniture design. To lie down properly now required accessories. Sleep, once a biological necessity, had become an art. Yet these developments were not universal. For the majority of people, farmers, herders, labourers, the old ways persisted. Straw heaps, mats, and animal skins remained the norm. In cities like Ur and Babylon, cramped dwellings left little room for specialised furniture. A single mat served as bed dining area, and workspace. The idea of a bed as a distinct object was itself a luxury. Most people still slept communally, as their ancestors had, though now inside mud brick walls instead of caves. The difference lay not in comfort, but in symbolism. Even a humble mat beneath a roof hinted at participation in an organized, permanent world. In both Egypt and Mesopotamia, the bed was deeply tied to belief. Egyptians imagined the sun god Ra reborn each dawn after his nightly journey through the underworld. Sleep was a miniature version of this cosmic cycle. Tomb paintings depict the dead lying peacefully on beds as they await resurrection, their headrests in place, their linen unwrinkled. The very form of the bed thus bridged life and death. In Mesopotamian texts, gods and kings were said to rest on divine couches, and temple rituals sometimes included the ceremonial preparation of a god's bed, complete with linens and offerings as a gesture of reverence. The bed, once a barrier against insects, had become a stage for theology. Practical innovation accompanied this spiritual meaning. The use of rope or woven reed bases created spring and flexibility, a primitive form of comfort, centuries before the invention of metal coils. Frames could be tightened with wooden pegs, much like later European rope beds. The same principle survives in many rural crafts today. Comfort was not an accident of technology. It was a side effect of engineering stability. A taut bed meant one could rest without rolling into the dust or damp below, and a strong frame meant the furniture could last long enough to be inherited. Sleep had acquired continuity. Archaeological finds also reveal repair marks, replaced ropes, patched legs, recarved feet. These details suggest attachment, a recognition that a bed, once made, deserved maintenance. It belonged to the family as much as the hearth or the loom did. The bed was no longer disposable. It carried the marks of age, of use, and of human hands, learning to preserve rather than abandon. Through it, rest became not just nightly, but generational. By the middle of the second millennium, BCE, the raised bed had become a fixture of civilized life, from the Nile Delta to the Persian Gulf. It embodied more than sleep. It was the threshold between the human and the divine, the clean and the unclean, the powerful and the powerless. To possess one was to signal that one had mastered the environment enough to rest above it. To lack one was to remain among the earthbound. By the time Greek city-states rose along the Aegean, the bed had evolved from a symbol of status into a central piece of daily life. The act of reclining was no longer merely practical. It was social, philosophical, and aesthetic. If earlier civilizations had elevated the bed from the ground, the Greeks elevated it in meaning. Their reclining, half couch, half bed, were where conversation, politics, and pleasure unfolded. In the Greek world, lying down was not a gesture of idleness but of cultivation, a position that implied learning, leisure, and civilization itself. The recline was more than a place to sleep. It was a piece of furniture designed for multiple roles: to recline while eating, to host guests, and to serve as a resting place at night. These couches were usually constructed of wood, with legs carved into animal forms or simple geometric designs, and covered with woven textiles or cushions stuffed with wool or straw. The typical Athenian household kept one or more reclini in the andron, the men's dining room, arranged along the walls for symposiums, those evening gatherings where wine mixed with philosophy, music, and occasionally politics. Reclining to dine was a marker of refinement. It separated citizens from servants, men from women, and Greeks from barbarians, who were often ridiculed for eating upright. The way one used a bed thus became a quiet expression of hierarchy. At these symposia, the bed set the tone for social exchange. A host's choice of couch covering or cushion material could communicate taste as effectively as conversation. Wool and linen were common, but dyed fabrics, particularly those tinted with costly murex purple, signalled wealth. The Klein also had ritual associations. It was used during funerary practices as mourners displayed the deceased upon it before burial. In art, gods and mortals alike recline. Even the dead are shown at rest, propped on one elbow, participating in the eternal banquet of the afterlife. Through this continuity, the bed linked the domestic to the divine. Greek philosophers often drew on this imagery of reclining to think about moderation and excess. The symposium could slide easily from conversation to indulgence, and the bed, as its stage, symbolized that tension. Plato's dialogues make reference to such gatherings, and Xenophon described how conversation flowed naturally from one couch to another, punctuated by music and food. In this context, sleeping and thinking were closer than they might seem. Both were forms of retreat, one from the day, the other from ignorance. To recline was to reflect. The Romans inherited and expanded this tradition. By the time of the Republic, the lectus had become both a bed and an emblem of domestic order. The Roman household revolved around a series of designated spaces: the triclinium for dining, the cubiculum for sleeping, and the atrium for receiving guests, all centred on variations of the same essential furniture. The lectus triclinaris in particular was used for formal banquets, arranged in groups of 3 around a low table. Guests reclined on their left sides, supported by cushions, and reached across to dine. Reclining was still the privilege of citizens and men. Women and slaves served or sat upright. In this geometry of comfort, one's posture revealed one's place. The lectus cubicularis, or sleeping bed, differed mainly in location and elaboration. Wealthy Romans invested heavily in these pieces: carved wood or bronze frames, legs inlaid with ivory, and surfaces strung with rope or leather thongs to support stuffed mattresses. A well-made bed could include multiple layers: wool, feathers, and soft textiles such as linen or imported cotton. The coverings might be dyed or embroidered, while pillows were often filled with goose down. Romans spoke about their beds as modern consumers might speak about furniture design, noting their beauty, craftsmanship, and the prestige of imported materials. The poet Martial joked about patrons who slept on Cyprian wood and Spanish wool, while their dependents had straw pallets that creaked in the cold. For the poor, the experience was less poetic. Most urban Romans, especially those in cramped tenement housing called insulae, slept wherever there was space, on straw-stuffed sacks, on benches, or directly on the floor. Workshops doubled as sleeping quarters. Apprentices and slaves often shared straw mats. The contrast between the senator's bedroom and the labourer's corner was stark but accepted as part of the natural order. The Roman bed thus mirrored the stratification of Roman society itself, ornate for some, invisible for others. The social life of the bed extended beyond dining and sleep. It was also a site of ceremony, illness, and death. Roman writers describe how the sick were attended in bed, how patrons received clients from it, and how the dying gave their final speeches reclining among family and slaves. The lectus funebris, a special funeral bed, bore the body through the streets during public processions. In homes, portraits of ancestors often depicted them reclining, preserving their dignity through posture. A citizen's final act was to demonstrate composure in repose, as though civilization required even death to be well arranged. Cleanliness, in the modern sense, was a secondary concern. Mattresses were aired and beaten, but the ancient world lacked the means to eliminate pests entirely. Fleas, lice, and mites were regular companions to both rich and poor. Comfort was measured less by hygiene than by appearance and proportion. A well-constructed lectus or cline displayed harmony of form, symmetry, and ornament, qualities that reflected both Greek ideals of beauty and Roman notions of order. The aesthetics of rest mattered more than the physiology of it. Yet despite their artistry, these beds were not purely decorative. They embodied the philosophical and social currents of their time. To recline was to acknowledge that human life contained moments worthy of pause and contemplation. The furniture itself, with its careful balance of utility and elegance, reflected a society that prized display as much as discipline. The same couch might host a meal, a debate, or a death, collapsing the boundaries between public and private existence. The continuity between Greece and Rome ensured that the bed remained a symbol of civilization's maturity. It represented the point at which rest became ritual and furniture became art. But this sophistication carried its own fragility. As political and economic stability fractured in the late empire, so too did the infrastructure that supported such refinement. Workshops that produced carved wood and bronze fittings closed or were repurposed for basic survival. Trade networks that once brought fine linen from Egypt and dyes from Tyre began to fail. The well-made beds of the Roman elite, preserved for centuries in fresco and verse, gave way to scarcity and improvisation. When the Roman world collapsed, its furniture went with it. The elegant bronze and ivory lectus vanished, and Europe returned to something closer to necessity. The centuries that followed were marked by scarcity and cold. Comfort, which had once been a symbol of refinement, became a privilege measured in degrees of warmth and inches above the ground. The medieval bed was less a piece of furniture than a form of defence against cold air, crawling insects, and, in a more abstract sense, the chaos of the world outside. For most people, sleeping arrangements were simple and temporary. Peasants, labourers, and servants slept on straw-filled sacks known as palliassa, or directly on wooden boards covered with furs. The straw might be changed a few times a year, if supplies allowed, though often it was merely shaken out and restuffed with whatever plant matter was available: hay, reeds, or dried leaves. Over time, the material flattened and grew dusty, mixing with sweat, dirt, and insects. Fleas and lice were an accepted part of existence. No one expected to escape them entirely. In such conditions, the distinction between sleeping and simply lying down blurred. Warmth mattered more than softness, and privacy was a luxury few even imagined. In single-room cottages, the family bed often served multiple purposes: a place to sit, eat, and keep infants warm. Children and parents slept together, sometimes joined by livestock in winter, for shared body heat. The hearth provided the only real warmth, but it was also a source of smoke and soot. Bedding absorbed both. A good night's sleep, in medieval terms, meant surviving the night without shivering or suffocating. The smell of straw and wood smoke hung in the air, mingled with the faint sweetness of fermenting hay. For those on the lower rungs of society, the bed was not furniture to be admired, but a tool for endurance. Among the upper classes, however, sleep became increasingly ceremonial. As castles and manors grew larger, the problem of warmth intensified. Stone walls and high ceilings trapped drafts, and winters could turn even the grandest chamber into a refrigerator. To solve this, medieval carpenters began building tall enclosed beds, wooden frames raised off the floor, often with canopies and curtains. These were not decorative draperies, but practical insulation. Heavy fabric panels could be drawn shut to hold in warmth, and to provide privacy in rooms that were rarely truly private. Servants and attendants might sleep nearby, on stools or pallets, ready to assist at any hour. Curtains offered a small enclosed world within the larger frigid hall, a personal microclimate of breath and candlelight. The medieval canopy bed also reflected hierarchy. Its height and ornamentation corresponded to the owner's rank. Nobles and clergy commissioned beds carved with intricate panels, coats of arms, and religious motifs. The frames themselves were feats of carpentry, built to last for generations. Beds became family heirlooms, passed down as symbols of lineage and legitimacy. The bedchamber, in turn, evolved into a semi-public space. Great lords and monarchs often held audiences or received petitions while reclining in bed, the curtains drawn back just enough to frame them as both human and elevated. The word bedchamber, in royal context, referred as much to political authority as to rest. In royal courts, the bed was the central object around which ceremony revolved. French monarchs of the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance maintained elaborate state beds, visible symbols of royal dignity. Even when not used for sleep, these beds were focal points of ritual. Ambassadors were received before them, courtiers observed morning and evening ceremonies around them, and births and deaths were staged upon them for public record. To stand at the foot of such a bed was to enter the sphere of power. The structure itself embodied sovereignty, combining the intimacy of the body with the grandeur of rule. Yet even for the wealthy, comfort had limits. Feathers and down offered softness, but trapped moisture and bred mites. Mattresses were stitched from linen or coarse wool, filled with straw, feathers, or a mixture of both. These were flipped and beaten to remove dust, but complete cleanliness was impossible. Bed linens were prized possessions, woven linen for the upper classes, rough hemp or wool for everyone else. Washing was rare and soap expensive. Sheets yellowed with use, pillows grew heavy with oil and sweat. Even queens slept amid vermin, their attendants tasked with discreetly picking through the bedclothes. The idea of cleanliness as a moral virtue was still centuries away. Seasonal adjustments were made with pragmatic precision. In winter, furs and heavy blankets layered the bed. In summer, lighter wool or linen replaced them. The bed itself often served as storage, with chests built underneath for valuables and clothing. In homes without separate bedrooms, curtains around the bed provided the illusion of privacy. Behind them, people prayed, wept, ate, gave birth, and died. The bed was the most personal space available, not a retreat from the household, but its core. The materials of medieval bedding also reveal the economies of the time. Straw came from local harvests, feathers from domestic geese, and wool from regional flocks. Each mattress was a record of agricultural life. The wealthier could import fabrics like silk or brocade for outer coverings, though these were more for display than function. Decorative cushions embroidered with religious or heraldic designs adorned the headboard area, visible to any visitor granted access to the chamber. Even in private rest, appearance mattered. A well-appointed bed spoke of stability, stewardship, and divine favour, qualities as valuable politically as they were personally. At the same time, the bed was a literal and symbolic enclosure. To sleep inside its curtains was to enter a small fortress against both cold and contamination. But the same closeness that kept warmth in also trapped moisture and air. Fleas thrived in these conditions, and the smell of unwashed textiles became part of daily life. The effort to seal out the world only concentrated its discomforts. The medieval bed was therefore both sanctuary and trap, a place of dignity, intimacy, and disease. By the later Middle Ages, the bed's cultural importance was firmly established. It was where power was displayed, lineage perpetuated, and bodies confined. Chroniclers described royal births and deaths with meticulous attention to the furnishings. The colours of the curtains, the fabrics of the sheets, the carvings on the posts. To record the bed was to record the person. A noble's life began and ended within its frame. The same could be said in simpler form for peasants on their straw sacks. Across classes, the bed defined the boundaries of existence. As Europe slowly recovered from famine and plague, trade routes reopened and foreign goods began to circulate once more. Textiles from the East, dyes from the Levant, and new weaving techniques enriched the material world of sleep. Travellers and merchants returned with stories of unfamiliar sleeping customs, woven mats, low couches, and hammocks. The medieval world, so long enclosed by its curtains, was beginning to look outward again. The bed would not remain a fortress forever. Soon as exploration expanded and cultural contact increased, Europeans would learn that their way of sleeping was only one among many. In China, domestic life revolved around the kang, a brick or earthen platform built as part of the structure of the house itself. The kang was both furniture and heating system. Hollow inside, it was connected to a small flue or stove that channeled warm air beneath the surface. In winter, families could sleep and sit on its heated top. In summer, the fire was extinguished and the bricks remained cool. This design provided both efficiency and endurance, perfectly adapted to the northern Chinese climate, with its bitter winters and dry air. A kang could span an entire wall, covered with reed mats, layered quilts, and pillows stuffed with cotton or plant fibres. During the day, bedding was folded away, and the space became a seating area for meals, tea, or conversation. At night, it transformed back into a communal bed. The kang thus blurred distinctions between sleeping, working, and socializing. Rest was not segregated from daily life, but integrated into it. The system also reflected a different attitude toward privacy. Rather than separate bedrooms, traditional Chinese homes prioritized shared warmth and family cohesion. Grandparents, parents, and children might sleep side by side, maintaining closeness through proximity. The act of sleeping together was both practical and moral, a sign of harmony within the household. Archaeological and literary evidence from as early as the Han Dynasty describes sleeping arrangements that combined function with symbolism. Headrests carved from wood or ceramic to preserve elaborate hairstyles, quilts embroidered with auspicious motifs, and raised thresholds on bedroom doors meant to keep out wandering spirits. Even in repose, the Chinese bed was a microcosm of order and meaning. Further east, Japan developed an entirely different approach, one that emphasized impermanence and cleanliness. Traditional Japanese architecture favored flexibility, lightweight wooden frames, sliding doors, and rooms that could serve multiple purposes. The sleeping system evolved accordingly. Rather than stationary furniture, the Japanese used tatami mats, thick, woven surfaces of rice straw, and futon, padded quilts that could be rolled out at night and folded away each morning. The arrangement suited a culture that valued simplicity and space efficiency. A single room might function as dining area by day, sleeping area by night, and ceremonial hall when required. The futon system also supported hygiene in a humid climate. Bedding was regularly aired outdoors to prevent mold and insects, and the smooth tatami floor could be swept clean. Sleeping near the ground allowed cool air to circulate during summer months, while winter called for additional layers of cotton or silk. Pillows were sometimes filled with buckwheat hulls to conform to the neck, an early form of ergonomic design. In Japanese philosophy, minimalism carried moral as well as aesthetic weight. To sleep close to the floor was to maintain humility and connection to the natural world. The morning ritual of folding and storing bedding reinforced discipline and order, turning the act of sleep into part of daily rhythm rather than escape from it. Across the Islamic world, from North Africa through the Middle East to Persia and India, sleep adapted to heat rather than cold. Here, elevation was unnecessary. The priority was airflow. Houses were built around courtyards, with shaded alcoves and high ceilings that encouraged circulation. Bedding typically consisted of low couches, carpets, and cushions that could be rearranged according to season and occasion. In wealthier homes, raised wooden frames or platforms, sometimes called sara, were draped with fine textiles, but even these retained a low horizontal orientation that complemented the surrounding architecture. Textiles played a central role in these interiors. Carpets served simultaneously as flooring, seating, and sleeping surfaces, their layered designs reflecting regional weaving traditions. During hot nights, families might sleep on rooftops, taking advantage of cool breezes, and carry their bedding indoors again at dawn. This mobility produced a different relationship to furniture. The bed was not an immovable object, but a collection of portable comforts. In literature and art, the imagery of repose, lovers reclining amid cushions, or travellers resting under a canopy, symbolised both hospitality and the fragility of life. Cleanliness was emphasised in Islamic tradition. Washing before prayer extended naturally to preparation for sleep. To lie down on fresh linen or clean carpets was not indulgence but observance. Farther south, in Africa and Oceania, sleeping arrangements reflected still other adaptations. In many African societies, the bed took the form of a raised wooden platform or woven mat positioned above ground level. This design protected against insects and dampness, allowing airflow beneath. Materials varied. Palm fronds, reeds, bamboo, and animal hides were woven or stretched across wooden frames. Some beds were elaborately carved, incorporating symbolic motifs tied to ancestry and spiritual protection. In regions where heat was constant and ventilation crucial, sleeping spaces were often outdoors, under thatched roofs or open skies. The division between day and night was softer. People napped or rested intermittently, adjusting their rhythms to temperature and light. In island regions of Oceania and the Caribbean, hammocks became the most efficient answer to climate and environment. Suspended between posts or trees, they offered safety from crawling insects and allowed air to flow freely around the body. Spanish explorers encountered this technology in the 15th century and quickly adopted it for maritime use, recognizing its practicality aboard ships. The hammock's gentle sway suited the motion of the sea, and its compactness made it ideal for confined quarters. What began as an indigenous solution to tropical life would later spread across the world, an example of how the simplest design could prove the most enduring. These varied approaches to rest reveal how differently societies defined comfort. In colder climates, warmth was luxury. In hotter ones, coolness was salvation. Some cultures prized elevation and enclosure, others valued openness and adaptability. The bed could be permanent, built into the house like the kang, or ephemeral, rolled and stored like the futon. It could signify hierarchy, as in the Chinese scholar's raised couch, or equality, as in the communal mats of Africa and the Pacific. In each case, the design expressed a worldview, whether sleep was a private withdrawal from the world or an integrated part of daily living. What united these systems was their logic. Every society, within its means, sought to balance safety, temperature, hygiene, and symbolism. Each turned the act of lying down into an extension of its environment and values. European travellers, upon encountering such diversity, were struck not only by unfamiliar forms, but by the realization that their own heavy curtains and feather beds were not universal signs of progress. The discovery that others slept comfortably without them raised questions about what comfort truly meant. By the time Europe entered the 15th century, sleep had begun to shed its medieval austerity. Trade with Asia and the Islamic world brought an influx of new fabrics, dyes, and decorative styles. Wealth, once measured in land or livestock, increasingly expressed itself through domestic refinement. The bed, large, central, and visually dominant, became the natural canvas for this transformation. What had once been a wooden frame, draped with heavy curtains to keep out cold, now became a stage for wealth and artistry. In the palaces of Italy and France, sleeping itself became theatrical, a daily performance of power and taste. The change began in Italy, where Renaissance ideals of proportion and design reshaped not only architecture, but furniture. Wealthy patrons commissioned beds carved from walnut or oak, their posts and headboards gilded, painted, or inlaid with ivory. Decorative motifs drawn from classical antiquity. Acanthus leaves, laurel wreaths, cherubs, and mythological figures replaced the plain panels of the Middle Ages. The bed was no longer built merely to endure, but to impress. Artisans who once crafted altarpieces and choir stalls now turned their skills to domestic interiors, producing pieces that blurred the line between furniture and sculpture. The sleeping chamber became an extension of the patron's identity, a room where every surface displayed mastery, education, and lineage. Fabrics completed the transformation. Velvet, brocade, and damask draped over frames and hung from canopies in layers of deep red, gold, and green. Embroidered curtains shielded sleepers not only from draughts, but from the gaze of visitors. In inventories from Florentine households, the bed and its hangings often rival the value of paintings or jewellery. Textiles were the most visible symbols of prosperity. A merchant's success could be read in the sheen of his linens. Silk, once imported at enormous cost from the East, became more accessible as Italian and French weaving centres developed. Patterned cloths from Lucca, Lyon, and Venice flooded the courts of Europe, and the bed absorbed them all, a portable gallery of texture and colour. This visual abundance reflected a larger social shift. The Renaissance introduced a new awareness of the private self, and with it, the private room. In medieval homes, chambers were communal spaces where family, servants, and guests circulated freely. But among the elite, new architectural plans created the camera, a room set apart for sleeping, dressing, and contemplation. Privacy, once suspect as a sign of secrecy or indulgence, began to acquire moral and intellectual prestige. The private bedchamber became a place for reading, correspondence, and reflection, a setting for the cultivated individual rather than the public household. The idea that one might retire alone to rest marked a quiet revolution in the history of sleep. At the apex of this transformation stood the state bed, the most elaborate and least restful object of the period. In the courts of France and England, these monumental constructions combined politics, art, and ritual. The monarch's bed was both stage and throne, where royal births were witnessed, marriages consummated, and audiences granted. The ceremonial lever and cowsher, the king's rising and retiring, became daily spectacles of hierarchy. Courtiers were invited to observe, not for intimacy, but to reaffirm social order. The bedchamber itself functioned as a miniature court, its furnishings designed for maximum display. Gold threaded hangings, silver-gilt finials, and embroidered coats of arms proclaimed authority even while the ruler slept. In France, the state bed reached its fullest expression under the Valois and later the Bourbon. Surviving examples from a Fontainebleau and the Louvre reveal dizzying layers of decoration, canopies fringed with tassels, headboards carved with allegorical figures, and coverlets stitched with heraldic emblems. The materials read like an inventory of empire: ebony from Africa, silk from Asia, feathers from the Americas. The royal bed was a world unto itself, a demonstration that global trade, divine favour, and domestic life could coexist in one object. Yet despite its magnificence, the bed's practical purpose diminished. Monarchs often maintained separate, more modest sleeping quarters nearby, using the grand beds solely for ceremony. Rest had become a formality. Feather and down mattresses, which had existed in simpler form for centuries, became status symbols during this period. Sumptuary laws in parts of Europe restricted their use to certain classes. A legislative attempt to preserve visible distinctions between nobility and commoners. Inventories and wills list them alongside jewels and estates. In France, a feather bed with 2 bolsters and a cover of crimson velvet might be valued as highly as a horse or a set of silver plate. These mattresses were stuffed with goose down or feathers, layered within linen casings and topped with quilted counterpanes. Their lightness and softness represented both luxury and progress, a triumph over the crude straw palliasse of earlier centuries. The effort to sleep comfortably had finally become a moral and social expectation. The aesthetic of comfort, however, remained inseparable from cost. A noblewoman's bedchamber might require teams of servants to maintain, hangings to be brushed and refolded, sheets to be aired and scented, and mattresses to be beaten to restore their loft. Beds were dismantled and transported between residences, reassembled according to the owner's rank. Even in smaller households, the bed retained symbolic importance. A dowry often included one, along with its linens, marking the beginning of a new domestic lineage. In this way, the bed became both property and inheritance, a tangible representation of family continuity. Paintings and literature of the Renaissance further reinforced the bed's dual nature as both intimate and public. Artists depicted the Annunciation, the Nativity, and countless mythological scenes set within elaborately draped chambers, emphasizing that divine or heroic events unfolded in spaces of luxury. The bed thus acquired spiritual resonance as well as sensual appeal. It was where heaven met earth, flesh met faith, and wealth met mortality. The paradox of a sacred bedchamber captured the Renaissance fascination with blending opposites, body and soul, private and public, life and art. Even so, the theatricality of elite sleep contrasted sharply with the realities of ordinary people. In towns and villages, most Europeans still slept communally on straw mattresses or shared wooden frames, the same arrangements that had persisted for centuries. Privacy remained rare, and warmth still dictated proximity. The sumptuous beds of the wealthy served less as models to imitate than as distant symbols of another world. Yet their influence was profound. The idea that sleep could reflect social rank, taste, and virtue began to permeate every level of society. A clean sheet, a softer mattress, or a bit of embroidery became tokens of aspiration. By the end of the 16th century, the Renaissance bed had achieved something no earlier form had managed. It united artistry, comfort, and display into a single cultural ideal. To own such a bed was to participate in the visual language of progress and civilization. It was both furniture and performance, a space where identity was rehearsed each night. The evolution from survival to spectacle was complete. The bed now embodied status as surely as the throne or the portrait. For all the gilded splendour of Renaissance courts, most Europeans continued to sleep in ways that would strike the modern world as remarkably communal. The invention of privacy was still incomplete. Across towns and villages, households large and small lived in tight proximity, and the bed, often the only piece of soft furniture in the home, had to serve everyone. Intimacy was less a choice than a physical fact of existence. To be warm in winter, one shared heat. To be safe in a noisy world, one shared space. The bed was a social institution long before it became a private refuge. In homes of modest means, family members slept together, out of necessity. Parents, children, and sometimes grandparents crowded into one mattress or onto a single wooden frame. Infants were swaddled and tucked between adults, protected by their body heat but also endangered by it. Accidental smothering was a known hazard. Servants might sleep at the foot of the same bed or on straw mats nearby, available to wake at dawn. In rural cottages, it was common for a single room to hold the hearth, workbench and bed, all within arm's reach. Night did not divide the family, it bound it. The soft rustle of straw, the smell of smoke, and the rhythm of breathing were shared elements of domestic life. This intimacy extended well beyond the family circle. In a world with limited travel infrastructure, inns and lodging houses filled the gaps between towns. Their business model depended on volume, not comfort. A traveller paying for a two-penny bed might find himself sharing it with a stranger, or several. Records from 17th and 18th century England describe inns where guests lay side by side, often fully clothed, beneath shared blankets. In cheaper lodgings, beds were rented by the half-night, allowing one occupant to rise for work, just as another arrived to take his place. Such practices were common enough that few questioned them. Travellers expected conversation, snoring, and the occasional theft. The notion of a bedfellow carried no romantic implication. It was simply part of the economy of rest. Yet the close quarters of communal sleeping also made the bed a place of contagion. Diseases passed easily through shared blankets, and vermin were unavoidable. London's lodging houses, described in the writings of social observers, were notorious for their warmth of company and the liveliness of fleas. The bed became a microcosm of urban life, crowded, restless, and morally ambiguous. To share sleep with strangers was to blur social boundaries, and reformers began to worry about what else might be shared in the dark. Moral anxiety about shared sleeping spaces grew in proportion to urban density. The 17th and 18th centuries saw swelling populations in European cities, where housing shortages forced multiple families into single rooms. Beds were sublet by the night or the hour. Tenants rotated through them like workers in shifts. Writers of the time lamented the erosion of modesty and the mingling of classes. To sleep beside someone of a different rank or reputation suggested disorder in both social and moral terms. Pamphlets warned that idle company breeds idler thoughts, and that proximity in sleep encouraged vice. In reality, most people were too exhausted to indulge in anything but rest, but the association between physical closeness and moral decline had taken hold. Among the lower classes, bed sharing was often framed as practical virtue rather than corruption. In the harsh winters of Northern Europe, warmth was a communal good. Children were sent to bed early, simply to heat the sheets for their parents. Sailors and soldiers shared blankets on campaign. Apprentices shared mattresses in workshops. Servants doubled up in narrow quarters. The physical proximity of nightly life built a kind of intimacy that went unspoken but shaped relationships. A bedfellow might become a confidant or rival, depending on the temperament of the pair. Diaries from the period record quarrels, gossip, and even friendships formed in this enforced closeness. In larger households, the pattern persisted, but with stricter hierarchies. A noble family's servants might sleep near the door of the master's chamber, ready to assist if called. Children of high birth often shared beds with attendants or tutors. The bedchamber remained semi-public, a space of supervision as much as rest. Privacy belonged to rank. Even then, it was rarely complete. Royalty and nobility were attended as they dressed, ate, and slept. Curtains enclosed the body, but not the gaze of authority. The difference between a shared bed and a ceremonial one lay only in purpose, not in solitude. Religious and philosophical attitudes toward the body further complicated the issue. The Church long regarded sleep as a vulnerable state in which sin could intrude. Shared sleeping arrangements, especially among the unmarried, were viewed with suspicion. Moralists and reformers used the metaphor of the bed to symbolize temptation and disorder. To keep one's bed pure became both a physical and spiritual challenge. In some convents and monasteries, communal dormitories were arranged with strict supervision, ensuring that even unconsciousness was governed by discipline. The association between solitary sleep and virtue began to take root. At the same time, the social value of bed sharing persisted in less moralistic circles. Among travellers and scholars, the presence of a bedfellow could signify companionship or trust. Letters and journals from the 17th century mention the habit casually: two men sharing a bed on a journey, or a host offering his best mattress to a guest. The intimacy was physical, but not necessarily sexual. It was a form of hospitality and mutual protection. In cold, unheated rooms, warmth was the simplest gift one could offer. Only later, as privacy became the standard, would this kind of closeness seem strange. The crowded bed also served as an informal exchange of information. In boarding houses and inns, people of different backgrounds mingled and talked before sleep. News, rumours, and ideas passed from traveller to traveller, spreading faster than written correspondence. The bed, cramped and noisy, was a space of inadvertent democracy. Anyone with a voice could be heard by those lying inches away. In this sense, communal sleep carried a social function beyond necessity. It bound the population together through proximity, turning fatigue into connection. But the Enlightenment would bring a new logic to the arrangement of domestic life. The ideals of cleanliness, order, and reason began to challenge the old acceptance of crowded rest. Medical writers linked shared sleeping to the spread of disease, and moral writers to the decline of virtue. Pamphlets extolled fresh air and individual bedding as signs of progress. To sleep alone came to signify self-control and refinement, while to share a bed was increasingly portrayed as primitive. The same reformers who promoted personal hygiene also promoted personal space. By the early 18th century, Europeans had begun to imagine sleep not only as a necessity, but as a reflection of personal virtue. After centuries of crowded beds and shared blankets, a new value system was taking shape, one that linked cleanliness, solitude, and morality. To have a clean bed was no longer simply a matter of comfort. It was a matter of reputation. The household that could keep its linens white, its pests at bay, and its air fresh signalled not just prosperity, but good character. This was the age when domestic order became moral order, and the bed sat at its centre. Several practical advances made this shift possible. Linen weaving, long practiced in regions like Flanders and northern France, expanded dramatically in both scale and quality. Improvements in spinning and bleaching produced finer, whiter fabric that could withstand repeated washing. Soap, once a luxury, became more widely available, and the labour of laundering, still arduous, became a mark of diligence rather than mere drudgery. For the first time, the middle classes could aspire to fresh sheets on a regular basis. Manuals on household management, popular among literate women, offered precise instructions for boiling, starching, and pressing linens, transforming domestic cleanliness into a science. The result was a quiet revolution in texture. Beds that smelled less of smoke and straw, more of sunlight and lye. As textile technology improved, the structure of the bed itself evolved. The rough sacks of straw that had served most families for centuries began to disappear, replaced by stitched mattresses stuffed with wool, horsehair, or feathers. Unlike the loose palliasse, these new mattresses held their shape, allowing them to be turned and aired. The move from straw to more resilient fillings also reduced the constant presence of pests, though not entirely. Feathers and wool could still harbour insects, but they signified a new level of refinement. To sleep on such materials was to distance oneself, literally and symbolically, from the soil. Comfort had become a visible social marker, an index of how far one had risen from the ground. Metalwork innovations further reinforced this pursuit of cleanliness. Iron and brass bed frames began to replace the wooden structures that had dominated since medieval times. Unlike wood, metal did not warp, rot, or provide easy refuge for bedbugs. It could be wiped down and polished, reflecting both light and labour. The gleam of a brass finial or the cool strength of an iron rail announced modernity and maintenance. Air could circulate freely beneath these frames, reducing the dampness that plagued older designs. For physicians of the Enlightenment era, this ventilation aligned perfectly with new theories of health, which emphasized fresh air, circulation, and the prevention of miasma, the bad air thought to spread disease. The same impulse that led people to open windows and bathe more frequently also transformed how they slept. As homes became warmer and more compartmentalized, the great curtains and canopies of the medieval and Renaissance bed began to fade from fashion. Heavy drapery, once necessary for insulation and privacy, now seemed oppressive and unhygienic. Dust collected in its folds, and stagnant air within the canopy came to be viewed as unhealthy. The new ideal was lightness, not only in fabric but in spirit. Beds were dressed in gauze or linen hangings, airy enough to allow ventilation but still decorative enough to signify gentility. The shift in style paralleled architectural change. Fireplaces grew more efficient, rooms smaller and easier to heat, windows larger and better glazed. The bed no longer needed to serve as a fortress against the cold. It could finally stand open, confident in the comfort of the room around it. Domestic manuals and moral treatises of the period often blurred the line between hygiene and virtue. Clean sheets were praised not just for their physical comfort, but for their moral symbolism. A tidy bedchamber reflected an orderly soul. Laziness and neglect, by contrast, were said to breed both filth and sin. One popular English guidebook advised that to sleep in sour linen is an offence to the body and an injury to the conscience. The labour required to maintain this standard, the washing, beating and airing of linens, fell largely to women and servants, and their diligence was held up as evidence of moral worth. The connection between domestic cleanliness and feminine virtue would endure long after the technology that inspired it had changed. Even within this new ideal of hygiene, social divisions remained visible. The wealthy could afford multiple sets of sheets, changed weekly or even daily. The poor might still sleep on straw with only a blanket for cover. But aspiration trickled downward. Servants learned their employers' standards and carried them into their own modest households. The language of moral cleanliness transcended class, even as its practice remained unequal. The idea that one should air a bed daily, wash linens regularly, and beat mattresses seasonally had become part of common domestic wisdom across much of Europe. The household that failed to meet these expectations risked being judged backward or unsanitary. Medical science lent further authority to these habits. Physicians and natural philosophers began to study the connection between air, moisture, and disease, concluding that cleanliness could prevent illness. The bed, warm, enclosed, and often damp, was treated as a potential breeding ground for contagion. Advice literature recommended lifting mattresses from their frames, exposing them to sunlight, and even fumigating them with vinegar or herbs. Bedrooms were to be aired each morning, and clutter removed to allow free movement of air. The new morality of hygiene was thus reinforced by the emerging empiricism of science. Health and virtue became indistinguishable. In wealthier homes, this ethos expressed itself through design and display. Bed linens were whitened to brilliance, embroidered with initials, and folded with geometric precision. Households took pride in the sight of a freshly made bed, its surfaces smooth and symmetrical, its sheets crisp and scented. Travellers and diarists of the period often commented on the refinement of a host's bedding as evidence of hospitality. The sight of a clean, well-made bed offered reassurance that one's host was civilized, trustworthy, and modern. Dirt, by contrast, became a moral accusation. The phrase filthy bed implied not only neglect, but degeneracy. Technological progress also changed how beds were used within the home. The emergence of smaller, more private bedrooms reflected a growing belief in personal space and hygiene. Where once multiple family members had shared one bed, now each aspired to their own. Privacy and cleanliness reinforced each other. To be alone in sleep was to be protected from the contamination, physical or moral, of others. The solitary sleeper became the civilized ideal, and the act of retiring to one's own bed took on a new dignity. The shared sleep of earlier centuries began to feel unclean, not just physically, but socially. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the pursuit of cleanliness and comfort met the power of machines. The values that had once defined elite refinement, fresh linen, firm mattresses, private space, were now within reach of the growing middle class. Industrialization transformed not only how goods were made, but how people thought about the spaces in which they lived. The bed, long a symbol of status and morality, became one of the first household objects to enter the age of mass production. Its evolution in the 19th century mirrored the larger ambitions of the Industrial Revolution: to make comfort mechanical, repeatable, and, in theory, available to everyone. The key technological shift came with the invention of the coil spring. Patented in the mid-1800s, the metal spring allowed mattresses to flex and recover, replacing the sagging lumps of straw or horsehair with a surface that supported the body evenly. It was a small innovation with vast implications. Springs could be made by machine, and mattresses could be assembled in factories rather than stitched by hand. What had once required the labour of upholsterers and household servants could now roll off a production line. The mechanisation of comfort had begun. Furniture factories quickly adapted to this new efficiency. Steam-powered saws, metal presses, and textile mills made it possible to mass-produce every part of a bed, from the frame to the bolts to the mattress itself. Iron and brass frames were stamped and moulded in identical patterns, while wooden headboards and footboards were turned on lathes to standard dimensions. Catalogues offered consumers a dizzying range of options, from simple cast-iron singles to elaborately carved bedroom suites. The industrial bed was modular, measurable, and interchangeable. Its parts could be replaced, shipped, or replicated anywhere, creating a new kind of uniformity that reflected the age's obsession with order and efficiency. This shift did more than fill homes with furniture, it redefined domestic space. In middle and working class households, where industrial wages made consumer goods attainable, the bedroom became a distinct and recognizable room. In earlier centuries, the line between public and private life had been porous. Families, servants, and guests often shared the same quarters. But the new century brought walls, doors, and separate chambers for sleep. Privacy, once the privilege of nobility, began to extend downward through society. The bed was no longer a communal object, but a personal one. Each family member might now have their own, even in modest homes. The factory-made bed, in its anonymity, democratized solitude. For the Victorians, this new privacy carried moral weight. The bedroom was imagined as a sanctuary of virtue, a space where discipline and respectability were maintained. Industrial society prized restraint in dress, speech, and bodily behaviour, and the bed, paradoxically, a place of vulnerability, became a focus of that restraint. Moralists advised that one should rise early, sleep modestly, and keep the bed neatly made. Disorder in the bedroom hinted at disorder in character. The old connection between cleanliness and morality persisted, but now it was framed in the language of self-control rather than divine order. The visual culture of the Victorian home reinforced these ideals. Engravings, advertisements, and etiquette manuals depicted bedrooms filled with symmetry and modest ornamentation. Iron frames gleamed with polish, coverlets were tucked in crisp triangles, pillows lay aligned like moral arguments. Even luxury was meant to appear disciplined. The same society that mass-produced pleasure also mass-produced its limits. Comfort, properly managed, was not indulgence but duty, a sign that the modern household functioned as smoothly as the machines that furnished it. Yet beneath this facade of restraint lay anxiety. Industrialization brought overcrowded cities, polluted air, and exhausting labour. The bed promised respite from the machine's demands, even as it was born of the same system. Factory workers who spent their days producing parts for others' comfort often returned to shared lodgings where multiple tenants rotated through the same bed in shifts, a grim echo of earlier centuries. In urban boarding houses, one could still buy a bed for the night, but now it might be a spring mattress rather than straw. Progress had improved the materials without entirely erasing inequality. The industrial bed symbolised both the spread of comfort and the persistence of hierarchy. Mass production also changed how people acquired and imagined their furniture. Mail-order catalogues, department stores, and urban showrooms transformed the act of buying a bed into a modern ritual of aspiration. Advertisements promised rest as pure as the mountain air or fit for a lady, translating moral virtue into consumer choice. The rhetoric of comfort became democratic in tone, but remained stratified in practice. Thread count, embroidery, and imported fabrics ensured that one's class could still be read in the details of sleep. A well-dressed bed announced middle-class respectability as clearly as manners or dress. Industrial design encouraged standardization, but it also invited aesthetic variety. Styles proliferated: Gothic revival, Rococo, neoclassical, all rendered through the same mechanical processes. A family of modest means could now furnish their home in imitation of aristocratic taste, buying mass-produced mahogany, which was often actually just stained pine, and cast iron frames painted to resemble bronze. The illusion of refinement could be purchased by instalment. What had once required generations of wealth could now be acquired through catalogues and payment plans. The democratization of the bed was both practical and symbolic. Everyone could now own a small piece of grandeur. Even as technology made beds more comfortable, medical and moral discourse continue to regulate how they should be used. Health reformers warned against excessive softness, arguing that firm mattresses promoted vigour and discipline. Sleep itself was moralised. Too little was irresponsible, too much self-indulgent. The ideal Victorian sleeper was regular, temperate, and punctual, a model of industrial timekeeping. The factory bell and the alarm clock governed both labour and rest. To sleep properly was to participate in the rhythm of progress. Within this structure, women were often positioned as guardians of domestic virtue. The maintenance of the bedroom, its cleanliness, its order, its quiet, fell under the realm of feminine duty. A tidy bed symbolised a well-managed household, just as a rumpled one hinted at moral decay. Middle-class guides advised young wives on the care of linens and the avoidance of unwholesome airs. The moral geography of the home centred on the bedroom, where purity was expected to prevail even as the city outside grew louder and dirtier. The industrial bed thus embodied the contradictions of its age. It was a product of mass manufacturing, yet a symbol of personal virtue, an object of comfort, born from labour that was anything but comfortable. It promised equality through standardisation. The same coiled springs, the same iron frames, the same linen sheets, but preserved distinction in decoration and price. A working-class family could own a bed that looked like a gentleman's, but the quality of its fill or the fineness of its fabric still revealed the limits of that equality. The dream of universal comfort remained, as ever, aspirational. By the end of the 19th century, the transformation was complete. The bed had become an essential item of modern life, standardised, saleable, and symbolic of both industry and intimacy. The language of morality that had once governed domestic hygiene now blended seamlessly with the language of marketing. Clean, fresh, and pure described both conscience and commodity. Comfort had become measurable, manufacturable, and profitable. The industrial bed promised that progress could be felt as well as seen, that the same forces reshaping cities and factories could also deliver a better night's sleep. It was a convincing illusion, one that suggested equality through shared convenience, even as social divisions persisted beneath the sheets. Mass production had conquered the mechanics of rest. What remained was to master its psychology. The next century would take that promise literally, turning the pursuit of comfort into a science. By the beginning of the 20th century, the bed had completed its transformation from a handcrafted household object to a mass-produced commodity. What industrialization had standardized, modern marketing would now personalize. The age of factories gave way to the age of advertising, and the bedroom, once a symbol of private morality, became a showcase for technological progress and self-improvement. The bed was no longer merely where one slept. It was where one performed the rituals of modern life. New materials led this evolution. The box spring, developed in the late 19th century but perfected in the 20th, provided a new level of bounce and resilience. Metal coils beneath the mattress allowed manufacturers to market scientific support for the spine, a promise that echoed the era's faith in engineering. Soon after came latex and foam rubber, products of the chemical age. Each innovation was accompanied by confident slogans about hygiene, posture, and rejuvenation. The mattress became a piece of technology, one that could be improved, upgraded, and eventually replaced. Its value lay not in its craftsmanship, but in its materials, and its marketing relied on the language of progress rather than comfort alone. The Second World War accelerated these trends. Wartime research into synthetic rubber and new foams, originally intended for aircraft and vehicles, found civilian application in the peace that followed. Mattresses became lighter, cleaner, and easier to mass produce. Hospitals, barracks, and hotels adopted standardized designs that emphasized sanitation and efficiency. Steel tubing replaced ornate brass frames, and smooth washable surfaces replaced carved wood. The new ideal was not luxury, but cleanliness. The modern bed was rational, minimal, and streamlined, a reflection of industrial design's belief that form should follow function. These institutional models quickly influenced the domestic sphere. Mid-century designers embraced simplicity and utility, stripping the bed of excess ornamentation. Scandinavian and Bauhaus aesthetics turned sleep into an expression of modern living. Low frames, neutral colours, and geometric precision. The bed's historical associations with ceremony and status gave way to a quieter ideal, calm efficiency. At the same time, the bedroom itself began to expand in purpose. Electric lighting allowed people to read or write in bed. Radios and later televisions made it a space of entertainment as well as rest. The private retreat became a stage for the public culture of consumption. The language of marketing adapted accordingly. In the early 20th century, companies such as Simmons, Sealy, and Serta began to advertise mattresses not just as furniture, but as instruments of health and beauty. Slogans like beauty rest and orthopedic design transformed sleep into a form of self-care, implying that a properly engineered bed could improve appearance, productivity, and moral stamina. As psychology and medicine increasingly explored fatigue, efficiency, and the body's rhythms, advertisers borrowed the vocabulary of science to sell comfort. To buy the right mattress was to invest in one's physical and emotional performance. Sleep became measurable, improvable, and marketable, a consumer good like any other. Hotels and hospitals played a central role in shaping these expectations. Both institutions sought to standardize the sleeping experience, one for hospitality, the other for health. In hotels, uniform mattresses and crisp white linens became the mark of reliability. The perfect bed was one that disappeared into the background, promising cleanliness without personality. In hospitals, adjustable frames and washable covers became synonymous with hygiene and control. These designs filtered back into domestic life, where the adjustable bed was reimagined as a symbol of luxury rather than illness. By mid-century, motorized bases and remote controls were marketed to consumers as modern marvels, merging convenience with medical-grade precision. The rise of consumer culture blurred the boundaries between necessity and aspiration. Department stores and mail-order catalogues presented the bedroom as a reflection of personal identity. Beds came in endless variations: twin, queen, king, California king, their size itself a form of social aspiration. Matching sets of dressers and nightstands reinforced the idea of the bedroom suite, an integrated design that turned private life into a coherent product. Glossy magazine spreads invited readers to imagine themselves in rooms of serene minimalism or plush luxury, their dreams curated by brand identity. The bed was no longer a background object. It was the protagonist of modern domestic fantasy. As privacy expanded, so too did solitude. In middle-class homes, separate bedrooms for children, servants, and guests became standard. The crowded sleep of earlier centuries was recast as unsanitary and uncivilized. The private bed became a marker of personal dignity and emotional space. Even within marriage, the idea of separate beds, briefly fashionable among the upper classes, symbolized self-restraint and hygiene rather than alienation. The physical boundaries of the modern home mirrored the psychological boundaries of its inhabitants. To have one's own bed was to be an individual. An individuality was now a moral virtue. The 20th century also brought a new alliance between science and marketing. Sleep studies emerged as a field of research, measuring brain waves, breathing, and movement. Though early experiments were confined to laboratories, their influence extended to the marketplace. Mattress companies adopted the rhetoric of physiology and ergonomics, claiming their products could align the spine, optimize circulation, or enhance rapid eye movement. Sleep was presented as a form of maintenance, the nightly servicing of the human machine. In advertisements, the sleeper was often portrayed as a figure of efficiency, well-rested, alert, ready to contribute to the modern world. To neglect sleep was to waste potential, both personal and economic. Meanwhile, the design of institutional beds reflected growing faith in universal systems. Hospitals, prisons, and military barracks adopted nearly identical metal frames and standardized bedding, emphasizing hygiene, durability, and control. The same principles guided mass housing projects and dormitories. The bed became the smallest unit of modern architecture, a rectangle of rest replicated across nations. Its design was meant to serve everyone equally, but it also symbolized conformity. To lie on a standardized mattress was to participate in a world that valued uniformity as much as comfort. By the middle of the 20th century, sleep, one of the few human experiences that had resisted control, became an object of study. What had once belonged to instinct and rhythm was now dissected in laboratories, measured in volts, and charted across pages of data. The age of the industrial mattress had promised mechanical comfort. The new age promised understanding. Scientists, engineers, and psychologists turned their attention to what people did for a third of their lives, and predictably, they began to quantify it. Sleep was no longer simply a state of rest. It was a system to be optimized. In 1953, researchers at the University of Chicago made a discovery that would redefine how the world understood the night. Using electroencephalography, a device that recorded brain activity through electrodes, they identified the distinctive pattern of rapid eye movement, or REM sleep. They found that this stage was linked to dreaming, and that it alternated through the night with slower, deeper phases of rest. The human night, once imagined as a single descent into darkness, was revealed to be a complex architecture of cycles. Subsequent studies mapped the progression of light sleep, deep sleep, and REM, transforming bedtime into a sequence of measurable events. This knowledge was immediately hailed as progress. At last, humanity could explain what had always been invisible. As research expanded, sleep laboratories multiplied. Subjects were invited to lie in sterile rooms, wired with electrodes, watched through glass by technicians. Their breathing, heart rate, and movements were recorded minute by minute. Patterns emerged that seemed to confirm what industrial society had already intuited, that rest was not passive, but productive, a process that could be managed for better results. Terms like sleep efficiency and sleep debt entered the language, converting rest into a matter of accounting. Where earlier centuries had moralized sleep in the language of virtue, the modern age did so in the language of data. These scientific insights soon influenced design. Ergonomics, the study of how the body interacts with its environment, turned its gaze to the bed. Manufacturers began to advertise mattresses shaped to the spine, pillows designed for posture, and adjustable frames that could elevate the head or knees for optimal circulation. The bed became a kind of medical device, offering individualized support based on weight and sleeping position. Smart materials followed, foams that responded to temperature, gels that redistributed pressure, and fabrics infused with antibacterial agents. The promise was precision, the idea that comfort could be engineered down to the millimeter. Parallel to these physical innovations came psychological ones. Sleep was reframed not as surrender, but as maintenance, a process to be controlled, improved, and justified. Self-help books instructed readers on how to train their circadian rhythms, as if rest were a discipline, like exercise or diet. Corporations sponsored studies linking sleep to productivity, arguing that better rest would yield better work. The bedroom, once a refuge from labour, was rebranded as its partner. Every hour of sleep was now a potential investment in performance. Technology soon made the measurement of rest accessible to the individual. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, wearable devices, from fitness trackers to smartphone apps, brought the logic of the sleep laboratory into the home. Accelerometers tracked motion, sensors measured heart rate and breathing. The resulting graphs promised intimate knowledge, minutes spent in each stage, interruptions, sleep scores. For many, this data became a nightly referendum on success or failure. People who once rose simply feeling rested now consulted screens for confirmation. The act of sleeping, once unconscious, became another item to monitor and improve. This transformation reflected a broader cultural shift. Modern life, with its constant connectivity and artificial light, blurred the boundaries between day and night. The natural cues that once governed rest, darkness, fatigue, silence, were increasingly overridden by screens and schedules. The new science of sleep offered guidance but also guilt. To sleep too little was negligence, to sleep too much was inefficiency. The ancient act of closing one's eyes became an exercise in self-management, another field in which one might fall short. Meanwhile, the architecture of sleep continued to evolve. In households that could afford it, individualized comfort replaced shared rest. Couples purchased separate mattresses, adjusted to different firmness levels, or even separate beds entirely, a quiet acknowledgement that intimacy and rest no longer aligned. Memory foam and adjustable bases made customization easy. No two sleepers needed to experience the same night. The trend reflected broader social currents, the rise of individualism, the retreat from communal living, and the growing discomfort with dependency. What had once been a shared necessity was now a personal choice, tailored to each body and preference. This pursuit of tailored perfection brought diminishing returns. Sleep, like happiness, resisted control. Studies revealed that anxiety about rest, the constant monitoring, the striving for efficiency, often made people sleep worse. The very tools designed to optimize rest amplified self-consciousness. Experts coined terms like orthosomnia, insomnia caused by trying too hard to sleep correctly. The dream of perfect rest became another form of wakefulness. Even the language of sleep began to sound mechanical. Mattresses responded to movement, beds adjusted automatically, and sleepers tracked their progress. The metaphors of the digital age, updates, optimization, feedback, replaced older ones of peace and surrender. The modern sleeper was not a dreamer, but a user, interacting with a system designed to produce measurable outcomes. Comfort became calibration. Institutions followed suit. Hospitals integrated advanced monitoring systems that tracked patients' sleep to improve recovery. Hotels advertised scientifically designed beds that promised guests the ideal night. Airlines marketed premium seats as sleep systems, complete with ergonomic cushioning and noise control. Everywhere, rest was quantified, branded, and sold. The human need for unconsciousness had become a conscious enterprise. Yet for all this precision, something essential was lost. The more society measured sleep, the less it seemed to experience it. Artificial light extended days. Digital screens invaded nights. Work and entertainment blurred until there was no clear boundary between effort and rest. People stayed awake to study their own exhaustion, confident that technology could compensate. The result was a paradox unique to the modern world. A population that knows more about sleep than any before it, yet struggles more than ever to find it. Psychologists and social critics began to note the irony. The same individualism that promised freedom left people isolated in their private routines. Shared sleep, the warmth of another body, the communal rhythms of families or dormitories became rare. Instead, each person slept on their own island of data, their nights summarized in graphs and percentages. The hum of machines replaced the rhythm of breathing once shared between companions. Comfort was individualized, but so was loneliness. By the turn of the 21st century, the science of sleep had achieved nearly everything it set out to do. It had mapped the mind in dreams, decoded the stages of rest, and designed furniture that could react to every twitch and sigh. What it could not restore was the one thing all its predecessors had taken for granted: the simple peace of unmeasured sleep. The modern bed, filled with sensors and circuitry, promised perfect rest but delivered awareness. People lay down each night surrounded by proof of their own fatigue, reassured only by the idea that knowledge itself was a kind of comfort. We have conquered every variable but the one that mattered: peace of mind. After 200 millennia of invention, the human species can regulate temperature, measure brainwaves, and design mattresses that remember us better than we remember our dreams. And yet the act itself remains elusive, the same surrender it has always been, disguised by the illusion of control. The story of sleep has reached its most rational chapter, but its ending feels strangely familiar. The bed, once a tool for survival, has become something else entirely, a monument to our longing to rest and our inability to simply do so. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story. Feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with another forgotten corner of history you'd like explored next. If you'd like early access to more of these quiet descents into forgotten history, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to support the show, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps more people find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chroniclers, Andrew S. and Rich Davis. Sleep well.